Birds are not aggressive creatures, miss. They bring beauty into the world. It is mankind...
Sam, 3 Southern fried chicken. Baked potato on all of them.
Welcome to episode 39 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair 2 movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we have 2 films based on works by Daphne du Maurier, an English novelist, playwright and biographer whose stories and novels have been adapted many times for stage, radio, TV and of course for film. First up, we have a story where nature strikes back, with The Birds from 1963 and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. This stars Tippi Hedren, Rod Taylor, Jessica Tandy, Suzanne Pleshette and Veronica Cartwright. Then we jump forward a decade for a study in grief, guilt and ESP in Venice with Don't Look Now from 1973. This stars Donald Sutherland, Julie Christie and Hilary Mason, and was directed by Nicolas Roeg. Along the way, we'll be discussing the life and works of Daphne du Maurier, the troubling relationship between Hitchcock and leading lady Tippi Hedren, the early career of director Nicolas Roeg, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, as always, I'd like to begin by stating the key sources that I've used in researching this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. So when talking about Daphne du Maurier, I have referred to her original stories, as well as several articles on Wikipedia, and multiple features and articles that can be found on the websites theindependent.com, theguardian.com, and dumaurier.org. When talking about Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, I have heavily referenced the book The Making of Hitchcock's The Birds, and this was written by Tony Lee Morale and published by Chimera Books. I've also referred to the book The Birds by Camille Paglia, which was published as part of the BFI Film Classics series. When discussing Don't Look Now, I have referred to the BFI Film Classics book, Don't Look Now, written by Mark Sanderson, as well as interviews and extras on the Blu-ray special edition from Studio Canal. And I have also referred to the book Don't Look Now by Jessica Gildersleeve, which was published as part of the Devil's Advocate series from Liverpool University Press. And finally, for the entire episode, I have referred to Wikipedia and also the IMDb pages for the films, the cast and the crew. Released in 1963, The Birds is the third Daphne du Maurier story that Alfred Hitchcock directed for the screen, though it's probably more accurate to say that this was inspired by the source material more than it was an actual adaptation. Reading the story just once, he retained only the title and the central concept, discarding the rest for characters and settings that he thought would be more commercially viable. While he might have had a point, though more on this later, the decision did not sit well with the writer, who by all accounts hated the liberties that he took with the material and was rather baffled by many of the changes. And this was not the first time that Daphne du Maurier had expressed doubts about Hitchcock's work. She had been very disappointed with his 1939 adaptation of her novel Jamaica Inn. This had received a mauling from the critics due to its deviation from the original text, and also the decision to replace her dark tone and characters with a much more light-hearted treatment. To be fair to the director, much of this was probably down to co-producer Charles Laughton, who also starred in the movie and insisted on more screen time. But while the critics, author, and also Hitchcock himself were less than happy with the end result, the film was a financial success, and paved the way for his Hollywood career. Hitchcock's first Hollywood movie was also based on a Daphne du Maurier story, this time her best-selling 1938 novel Rebecca. After Jamaica Inn, she only agreed to the adaptation because of producer David O. Selznick, who reportedly told Hitchcock, "I've paid a lot of money for this book, and so we are going to stick to the story." As a result, the film was much closer to the original text, and it was this, as well as the critical and financial success of the film, that smoothed the way for her later agreeing to sell him the rights to the birds. Sadly, as we've heard though, she would again be disappointed with the results. And I have to say, while I personally like the movie very much, I do still think that in the original story there is an absolutely terrifying horror film just screaming to come out, if only it were in the right hands. Daphne du Maurier was born in London in 1907 to a very distinguished theatrical and creative family. Her grandfather was called George du Maurier, and he was a French-British illustrator, cartoonist and novelist. George had been brought up to believe that his aristocratic grandparents had fled from France during the Revolution, leaving behind them vast wealth and vast country estates to live in England. But, as it turns out, the truth wasn't quite so romantic. His grandfather had actually been called Robert Mathurin Busson, and he was a tradesman who had fled Paris in 1789, not to escape the revolution, but to avoid charges of fraud. He later changed the family name to du Maurier, presumably to cover his tracks, and also because it sounded much grander. After studying art in Paris, George became a cartoonist and illustrator for many publications, including the British satirical magazine Punch. But he also became a writer, publishing 3 books in his lifetime, including the novel Trilby in 1894. This was a Gothic novel and told the story of an artist model living in Paris, and it was hugely successful, selling 200,000 copies in the US alone. And in the US, it had a pretty remarkable impact on youth culture. The writer and critic Lucy Sante later said that it, quote, affected the habits of American youth, particularly young women, who derived from it the courage to call themselves artists and bachelor girls, and to smoke cigarettes and drink Chianti. End quote. It was also adapted for the stage, a production of which featured the lead actress wearing a rather distinctive hat. The popularity of the play, and also of the costume, led to the hat being known as a trilby, a name by which, of course, it is still known today. The story has also been adapted many times for cinema, both under the original book's title of Trilby, and also perhaps the now better-known title Svengali. Svengali was the name of Trilby's malignant mentor in the novel, and is another word that the story gave to the English language, meaning a person who exercises a controlling or hypnotic influence on another, particularly for sinister purposes. George married his wife Emma in 1863, and they had 5 children. These included daughter Sylvia, whose own children would become the inspiration for the novel Peter Pan, and Daphne's father Gerald. When he grew up, Gerald became an actor and manager, and was so famous that the du Maurier brand of cigarettes was named after him, and this was part of an endorsement deal that he agreed on to pay off a tax bill, making him, I guess, a very early influencer. So, as you can tell, French aristocracy or not, when Daphne was born in 1907, it was into a world of privilege. Because of her father's celebrity, when she was a child, she met many famous theatre actors, including Tallulah Bankhead, who she called the most beautiful woman that she had ever seen. After being homeschooled and then educated in Paris, Daphne began writing when she was a teenager, a career that was initially boosted by her family's many, many connections. Her first stories were published by her uncle in his magazine The Bystander, and then in 1931 she published her first novel called The Loving Spirit. This was a family drama set in the county of Cornwall, where the family had a second home, in a village called Badinnick, which is near the coastal town of Foy. Cornwall would play a significant role in both her life and her work. Many of her stories, including Rebecca, The Birds and Jamaica Inn, are set there, and she spent as much time there as she possibly could, eventually moving there full-time in 1943. And to this day, there is still an annual literary festival held in her honour in the town of Foy, which is incidentally near where I went to school many years ago. She followed this with 2 more novels. The first was called I'll Never Be Young Again. Yeah, tell me about it. And that was published in 1932. And this was followed by The Progress of Julius, which was published in 1933. Between the publication of these, in 1932, she married Major Frederick Browning, with whom she later had 3 children. Browning was a military officer, 11 years her senior, and he had sought her out after admiring her writing. As you can imagine, due to his military life, they spent much time apart, particularly as during World War II, he was appointed commander of the British 1st Airborne Division. This did, however, give Daphne time and space to write, and she began writing her second novel, Jamaica Inn, in 1935. Published in 1936, Jamaica Inn is the story of smugglers, and was inspired by a 1930s stay in the real-life inn of the same name. The original Jamaica Inn can still be found to this day on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall, and if you ever get the chance to visit or even stay there, then I highly recommend it. As we've heard, it was then turned into a movie by producer Charles Laughton and director Alfred Hitchcock, both of whom had been friends with her father, who had by this time died, passing away in 1934. Then, in 1938, she published the novel Rebecca, which went on to become a bestseller and made her one of the most popular authors of her time. Despite its success, it wasn't very well received by critics when it was released. The Times said that the material was of the humblest and that nothing in it was beyond the novelette, while the literary critic V.S. Pritchett wrote that it would be here today and gone tomorrow. Given that the book has never gone out of print, has been translated into more than 20 languages, and sells an estimated 4,000 copies a month in the States alone, I think it's safe to say the critics got that one wrong. Rebecca is a Gothic novel that tells the story of an unnamed female narrator who rather suddenly marries a wealthy widower. Following the wedding, she moves to his country estate in Cornwall, a house called Manderley, and that's a name that is captured in the very famous opening line, "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again." But unfortunately for our unnamed heroine, both the house and the marriage are haunted, metaphorically, if not literally, by her husband's first wife, the titular Rebecca, whose memory is kept alive by the incredibly manipulative and obsessive housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. It's a brilliantly atmospheric novel and has been adapted numerous times for both film and television. There is, of course, the famous Alfred Hitchcock version, starring Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine, and this received 11 nominations at the Oscars, winning Best Picture and Best Cinematography. As I mentioned earlier, du Maurier was very much enamoured with this adaptation, especially the 2 leads. She also enjoyed hearing the gossip behind the making of the film, which was mainly that Laurence Olivier found Joan Fontaine to be rather boring and wanted his then-wife Vivien Leigh to play the role instead. And this is something that the author found highly amusing, reportedly saying that Vivien Leigh would probably have sacked Mrs. Danvers on day 1. There have been numerous other adaptations since then, the most recent of which was a Netflix version in 2020. This was directed by Ben Wheatley and stars Lily James, Kristin Scott Thomas and Armie Hammer, but I have to say I didn't really like this adaptation very much. But then again, Alfred Hitchcock is a rather tough act to follow. Du Maurier followed this with many more novels, several of which have been adapted into films. These include Frenchman's Creek, which was published in 1942 and was adapted for the screen in 1944, and Hungry Hill, which was filmed in 1947. She published the book My Cousin Rachel in 1951, and this was filmed in 1952, starring Olivia de Havilland and Richard Burton, and also quite recently in 2017, starring Rachel Weisz and Sam Claflin. And then in 1952, she published a collection of rather dark and somewhat supernatural short stories. In the UK, this was released under the title The Apple Tree, but it was published in the US under the name Kiss Me Again, Stranger. The stories include the title tale, which is about a man who becomes increasingly disturbed by an apple tree growing in the orchard, and a horrifying tale of nature on the attack, called The Birds. The inspiration for this story came from Cornwall. Walking one day, she saw a flock of gulls following a tractor as the farmer ploughed his fields. Struck by the noise and the aggressive way in which the gulls dived down for worms disturbed by the plough, the image stayed with her, and she started crafting the story that would eventually inspire Alfred Hitchcock. And now we are getting into the spoilers for both the original story and for the Hitchcock film. And while at this point I would normally say, if you haven't watched the movie, proceed with caution, I would also add that I highly recommend finding the original story and reading that as well. Unlike the movie, the story is set in the Cornish countryside, and the central character is not a socialite called Melanie Daniels, but is a disabled war veteran called Nat Hocken. And unlike Melanie, Nat is struggling to support his young family and works part-time on a farm owned by a man called Mr. Trigg. One night, Nat hears a tapping at the bedroom window, and on opening it is attacked by a flock of birds, trying to peck at his eyes. His children's room is equally overwhelmed, and he has to rush in to save them. Quote, "There came a second cry of terror, this time from both children, and stumbling into their room, he felt the beating of wings about him in the darkness. The window was wide open. Through it came the birds, hitting the ceiling and the walls, then swerving in mid-flight, turning to the children in their beds. 'It's all right, I'm here,' shouted Nat, and the children flung themselves, screaming, upon him, while in the darkness the birds rose and dived and came for him again." End quote. Nat manages to save the children and to kill many of the birds, but the next day nobody really believes him. Disposing of the birds' dead bodies, he sees thousands of gulls sitting out at sea, riding the waves, as if they are waiting for something. When he gets home, his wife tells him that she has heard a broadcast on the radio and has written it down. Quote, "Statement from the Home Office at 11 a.m. today. Reports from all over the country are coming in hourly about the vast quantity of birds flocking above towns, villages and outlying districts, causing obstruction and damage, and even attacking individuals. It is thought that the Arctic airstream, at present covering the British Isles, is causing birds to migrate south in immense numbers, and that intense hunger may drive these birds to attack human beings. Householders are warned to see to their windows, doors and chimneys, and to take reasonable precautions for the safety of their children. A further statement will be issued later." End quote. Having seen the gulls out at sea and fearing that the worst is yet to come, Nat boards up the house and goes to collect his daughter from the school bus stop, seeing ominous omens as he waits for the school bus to arrive. Quote, "The east wind came whipping across the fields from the higher ground. He stamped his feet and blew upon his hands. In the distance, he could see the clay hills, white and clean against the heavy pallor of the sky. Something black rose from behind them, like a smudge at first, then widening, becoming deeper, and the smudge became a cloud, and the cloud divided into 5 other clouds, spreading north, east, south, and west. And they were not clouds at all. They were birds. He watched them travel across the sky, and as one section passed overhead, within 200 or 300 feet of him, he knew from their speed that they were bound inland, up country. They had no business with the people here on the peninsula. They were rooks, crows, jackdaws, magpies, jays, all birds that usually preyed upon these smaller species. But this afternoon, they were bound on some other mission. They've been given the towns, thought Nat. They know what they have to do. We don't matter so much here. The gulls will serve for us. The others go to the towns. End quote. Much like in the film, there is no real rationale given for the birds' sudden attacks. And despite what the broadcast on the radio might have said, this is nothing to do with the Arctic airstream. Nat collects his daughter from the bus stop and prepares for the worse that is to come. The apocalyptic nature of the story and the boarding of the house foreshadows films like Night of the Living Dead and more recently 28 Days Later. Scholar Kyle William Bishop has suggested that the tale is the most influential end-of-the-world narrative of the mid-20th century, and writer Scott Allberg has said that the initial attacks in du Maurier's work certainly remind him of the startling beginning to George Romero's 1968 classic horror. And I have to say, I agree. Du Maurier's story, far more than the movie, is lean, spare, and absolutely terrifying. Given the time that it was written, there are, of course, analogies to war, with Nat's boarding of the windows reminding him of preparation for air raids. But more than this, there is a sense that man has had his time upon the earth, and that nature has decided to wipe us all out, once and for all, and quite honestly, who can blame it? It's remarkably dark and bleak, and as I said earlier, it is my opinion that within this story there is an absolutely brilliant British horror film just waiting to be made. Rural setting, original working class characters, and all. There have been those who have mooted many times that the Hitchcock movie should be remade, probably to improve upon the admittedly rather dated special effects. But, in my opinion, if somebody ever wanted to attempt that, they could do far worse than jettison the Hitchcock plotline altogether and return to the original source material. But that's probably just wishful thinking on my part. As I mentioned, the story was first published in the collection The Apple Tree in 1952, but importantly for this episode, in 1959 it was also reprinted in the States in a collection titled Alfred Hitchcock Presents 14 of My Favourites in Suspense. This was a tie-in to the popular TV series Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which had been running in the States beginning in 1955. And it was this reprint that brought the story to the director's attention. At the time, Hitchcock was still filming Psycho, but had already begun to look for his next project. Already very familiar with du Maurier, he passed the story to his script supervisor, a man called Marshall Schlom, who recalled being given the story during the filming of Hitchcock's 1960 movie. Although he was impressed by the premise on his initial and only read, Hitchcock's daughter Pat later said that the director had some doubts about the story's cinematic potential. At the same time, though, he was apparently desperate to find a new story for his next movie, particularly when Psycho became a huge success, and so he set about purchasing the film rights in January 1961. By this time, du Maurier's stories had been adapted for film many times, and so she had agents working in both LA and London, and it was with these agents that conversations first began. But there was a minor snag. The film and TV rights to the US imprint, Kiss Me Against Stranger, had originally been agreed with CBS Television, and if they had already begun production of an adaptation, then the idea would come to nothing. Fortunately, though, CBS had done nothing with the property, and the rights had reverted to du Maurier in June 1961. Hitchcock purchased them for $25,000, which is the equivalent of $725,000 today. A very nice amount, I'm sure you will agree, but what du Maurier and her agents didn't know was that Hitchcock was so desperate for the story, he had been prepared to offer double the amount. So this means that du Maurier and her agents missed out on earning the equivalent of $1.5 million in today's money. Despite this, though, Hitchcock still had doubts about the story's potential and knew that if it was to work on film, he needed a very good screenwriter. He initially approached Joseph Losey, who had adapted Robert Bloch's novel for Psycho, but Losey declined, saying that he didn't think birds had much potential for horror. A writer called James Seneke was then approached, but his suggestion that the birds should never actually be seen on screen ruled him out very early on. Ray Bradbury was then considered, but he was already working on scripts for the Alfred Hitchcock Presents series. Eventually, Hitchcock approached Joan Harrison, who we mentioned last week, and who was by this time producing the Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV series. Harrison and the show's co-producer Norman Lloyd suggested a writer called Evan Hunter. He was a novelist who, under the pseudonym Ed McBain, had written a series of very successful books under the umbrella title of the 87th Precinct stories. Unsurprisingly, Hunter agreed, and he immediately received a telephone call from Hitchcock, something he recalled in the 1982 round table hosted by the French magazine Cahiers du Cinéma. Quote, "The first thing he said was that he never wanted to work in Britain again, and certainly did not wish to use as his lead characters an inarticulate farmer and his dreary wife." End quote. Hitchcock told Hunter that they should jettison du Maurier's original story and retain only the title and the general idea of birds attacking humans. And with this advice ringing in his ears, Hunter and his family moved to LA, where he began working on the screenplay. The first few weeks were spent in detailed discussions with Hitchcock, trying to establish the story around which the bird attacks would occur. Both agreed that the central character should be a woman, which was based on the rather unscientific and completely unfounded belief that women have a greater psychological fear of birds than men. Hunter's original, and thankfully very quickly abandoned idea, was to centre the story on a murder mystery, and then his second was to focus on a new school teacher who arrives in town. This too was very quickly dismissed, as Hitchcock wanted a more glamorous character for the lead, and this was influenced probably by the fact that he was trying to lure Grace Kelly, star of Rear Window and Dial M for Murder, out of retirement following her marriage to Prince Rainier of Monaco. It was Evan Hunter who had the idea of beginning the film as a light comedy, a battle of the sexes that would gradually descend into horror, something that would shift the eventual nightmare scenario into high contrast with what had gone before. Hitchcock saw the appeal of the idea immediately, and the two set out developing the central characters. Inspired by the madcap comedies of the 1940s, which often revolved around a frivolous heiress and a more stolid male counterpart, they decided on a spoiled rich girl called Melanie Daniels and a pro bono lawyer called Mitch Brenner. In my opinion, Hitchcock and Hunter still had the image of Grace Kelly firmly in their heads when they decided this, as the characterization and premise is rather reminiscent of Grace Kelly and Frank Sinatra in the musical High Society, which had been released in 1956. This approach explains the opening of the film, which could easily be mistaken for a somewhat frivolous romp if one didn't know what to expect. Opening in a San Francisco pet store, we meet Melanie Daniels, beautiful, poised, and inquiring about the purchase of a minor bird. We later discover that she has chosen this specific breed as a gift for her Aunt Tessa, though being Melanie, there is a slight catch. "I'm giving her a minor bird when she comes back from Europe," she says. "Minor birds talk, you know. Can you see my Aunt Tessa's face when this one tells her one or two of the words I've picked up at Berkeley?" Clearly one for practical jokes, she poses as a sales clerk for her own amusement, hoping to prank a stranger who we later learn is called Mitch Brenner. He, though, as it turns out, knows all about Melanie's reputation, though it must be said this is her tabloid reputation rather than her real character. He turns the tables on Melanie, telling her to get back into her gilded cage and suggesting that a previous prank, involving the smashing of a shop window, should have seen her locked behind bars. Doubtless, if Melanie were around today, she would be making a fortune on TikTok and have earned the ire of the likes of Piers Morgan. Not that she needs the money. Her father is the owner of several national newspapers, and this is a fact she uses to her advantage when she decides to regain the upper hand. Asking an employee at the paper to track down Mitch through his license plate, she decides to present an ironic gift of lovebirds, the birds that he had been looking to acquire in the pet store, as a present for his little sister, Kathy. So far, so conventional. In fact, one might even call it trite. Had either of the characters burst into song during the first few minutes, one wouldn't be at all surprised. And the film progresses with this battle of the sexes narrative for nearly a full hour. "I loathe you," Melanie tells him when they sit in the diner. "You have no manners, you are arrogant and conceited." And these are lines which, again, could have been taken from pretty much any romantic comedy of the 1940s. Beneath all this, though, there are hints in the screenplay suggesting what lies ahead, and these were added under Hitchcock's instruction, a demonstration of his ticking time bomb approach to suspense that we discussed back in episode 35. The viewer, informed by the knowledge of the original story and the film's title and marketing campaign, knows only too well that something terrible is about to happen with the birds. However, Melanie, Mitch, and the other characters are all oblivious, and so their petty rivalries, pranks, and jealousies all seem rather trivial when compared with what we are expecting next. The foreshadowing includes a mass of birds circling over San Francisco in the opening moments, a gull that dive bombs Melanie when she is driving a small powerboat in Bodega Bay, news that the Brenner family chickens are off their food, schoolteacher Annie complaining about constant migration, and a flock of gulls lining the telephone wires by the Brenner house as Melanie and Mitch argue after dinner. Most ominous of all, though, there is a seagull that dive bombs the door of Annie's house when she and Melanie are retiring for bed. "Poor thing, it must have lost its way in the dark," Annie says, as the two look at the bird's broken body on the doorstep, to which Melanie quite rightly responds, "But it isn't dark, Annie. There's a full moon." Even with these portents, the build-up is incredibly slow, and it is hard to imagine a studio horror these days taking an hour to get to the main event. One might argue that Ari Aster does this to some degree with his 2019 movie Midsommar, but even in that film, we have a rather grisly murder-suicide and hallucinogenic drug trips to keep us entertained before the film descends into madness. In The Birds, we have only the burgeoning romance and flirtations between Melanie and Mitch, and the uncomfortable family dynamic presented by Mitch's mother Lydia to keep us engaged. It was therefore essential for Hunter and Hitchcock to make the characters as engaging as possible, and this is something that Hunter seemed to struggle with in developing the screenplay, at least as far as Alfred Hitchcock was concerned. He was so troubled by the incredibly two-dimensional representation of Melanie, as well as other elements of the story, that he sent Hunter's draft to other writers to get their opinion, something that seemed to be a regular practice for Hitchcock, but which, quite understandably, annoyed the screenwriter when he found out. Even going into production, Hitchcock wasn't happy with some of the characterization and dialogue, creating changes during the filming process, which was a far cry from his usual method of highly meticulous pre-planning. As well as developing the characters on the page, it was incredibly important to find the right leads, particularly as the director believed that the birds, and not the actors, should be the stars of the show. The character of Melanie is of course central to the story, and while it might have been modelled on the types of roles that Grace Kelly used to play, Hitchcock wanted to find a real unknown. This was not only for the film that he was creating, but also because, at the time, the Hollywood studios believed that they had a shortage of female stars. The owner of Universal Pictures announced, quote, "We're out to amass the greatest array of new talent that we can find," end quote, while 20th Century Fox declared that screen tests for all comers was their new motto. Part of this was doubtless caused by the Hollywood edict that female leads can only be a certain age, and many of the stars of the previous decade had either quote-unquote aged out, or, in the case of the likes of Marilyn Monroe and Judy Holliday, had literally died. Competition with the television market was also fierce, and one studio executive moaned that the studios were quote-unquote recovering from TV. Ironically enough, though, it was television that would introduce Hitchcock to the actress who would play his lead. This was a model called Tippi Hedren, who he saw one morning on TV in an advert for, rather strangely, a pet milk diet drink. Immediately struck by what he perceived to be a certain quality, he called his agents and asked them to, quote, find the girl, end quote. Hedren, who to modern audiences may now be best known as Dakota Johnson's grandmother, was born in 1930 in Minnesota. She was named Natalie Hedren at birth, and her unusual nickname came thanks to her Swedish heritage, as it's an abbreviation of the word Tupsa, which means little girl. A successful model in New York in the 1950s, Hedren had originally no interest in acting, but she had begun taking acting lessons in 1959 to help her gain contracts for commercials. She married an actor called Peter Griffith in 1952, with whom she had a child named Melanie, but the two divorced in 1961, leaving Tippi struggling to raise her child on her income from modelling alone. After the divorce, she and her daughter moved to California, as she thought this a better environment in which to raise a child, but the move did very little to help her modelling career. She later said, quote, I thought I could continue my career as it had been in New York, so I rented a very expensive home. I thought everything would be just fine, but it wasn't. So I thought, well, I don't type. What should I do? End quote. In October of 1961, she received a call from her agent who told her that a Hollywood producer wanted to meet her. The identity of the producer was initially kept secret as she held several meetings with various studio executives, but then she was eventually told that it was Alfred Hitchcock. Incredibly surprised, she has said she didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and a meeting was arranged with Hitchcock the following day. But even before meeting her, the director had taken steps to sign her to a contract, based purely on a conversation with studio executives. Apparently, he simply asked over the telephone, how does she look? And when they responded that she looked quote-unquote fine, he instructed that they sign her there and then. The two met in his office at the studios the next day, and within a week she had signed a new 7-year contract with Alfred J. Hitchcock Productions. But even then, as she went through multiple screen tests, she still thought that they were considering her just for a role or two in the Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV series, and it would not be for another 3 weeks that she would discover that they wanted her to play the lead in The Birds. The two worked closely together on the development of the character, though, as you can imagine, it was more of a one-way conversation. She later said, quote, Melanie Daniels is his character. He gives his actors very little leeway. He'll listen, but he has a very definite plan in mind as to how he wants his characters to act. With me, it was understandable, because I was not an actress of stature. I welcomed his guidance. End quote. She also sat in on meetings discussing all aspects of production, later saying that she learned more in the 3 years making The Birds than she would have done in 15 had she gone down a more normal route. Unfortunately, and as has been very well documented, the relationship between Hitchcock and Hedren would take some very dark turns. This was particularly true on the second picture that she made with him, Marnie, which was released in 1964, and on which she revealed she was the subject of sexual harassment. But even during the filming of The Birds, there were signs that he was controlling, becoming more of a Svengali to her Trilby than he was a director to a lead actress. One day, concerned that she was losing weight, he sent a basket of bread rolls to her door with a written instruction for her to eat them. Co-star Rod Taylor, who plays Mitch Brenner, also recalled that he was repeatedly told not to socialise with Hedren after hours. He also said he was not allowed to show any affection between takes, and even had to ride in a different car to the actress when travelling to and from location. It was a very weird situation, he later recalled. Hitchcock was very possessive of Tippi. She was his next Grace Kelly, and I found it very strange. For her part, Hedren later said of Hitchcock, "He's a very psychological director. He works on you like putty." Although the harassment didn't really begin until she started filming Marnie, the experience of shooting the birds was a very difficult one for the actress, and on at least 2 occasions she was physically hurt during filming. The first occurred filming the scene outside the diner, when a car explosion attracts an attack of the gulls, and Melanie becomes trapped, rather ridiculously in hindsight, in a glass telephone booth. In an interview with the writer and philosopher Camille Paglia, Hedren said that the car was exploded for real, and that despite a protective pane of glass between she and the fire, her eyelashes and eyebrows were burned. Her eyes, in fact, remained a flaming bright red for several days, and required medicated eye drops. In addition, when a fake gull hit the glass panel of the phone booth, which was supposed to be shatterproof, it broke into Hedren's face. Tiny pieces of glass flew into her cheeks, and the shards had to be removed later at the studio clinic. Worse, though, was still to come, and this is a story that she recounted in her memoir Tippi that was published in 2017. Quote, "Everything was building towards the famous bedroom scene, the scene in which Melanie, still inexplicably as far as I'm concerned, goes up the stairs alone, steps into the bedroom and closes the door, and suffers the most vicious on-camera attack by the birds in the whole film. Some critics and Hitchcock buffs have compared it to the legendary shower scene in Psycho. Hitchcock had outlined it for me in great detail. It would just be me and a flock of relentless, homicidal, but mechanical birds. I'd have no way to escape, and I would be alone on the floor, completely terrorised and almost mortally wounded." He lied. End quote. She goes on to say that on the day of shooting, the assistant director came in to see her in her dressing room and for some reason couldn't look at her. His eyes, she said, were all over the place, the floor, the ceiling, the walls, everywhere but her, and he also wasn't saying a word. When she finally asked him what was wrong, he admitted the truth. The mechanical birds weren't working, he said, so they were going to have to use live ones. When she arrived on set, she saw that a cage had been built around the attic door, and inside the cage were 4 big cartons of gulls and ravens. Standing by were the birds' trainers, all wearing big thick leather gauntlets up to their elbows to protect themselves from being scratched or bitten when they held the birds. For days on end, Tippi Hedren, without protective clothes and dressed in her skirt and suit jacket designed by Edith Head, filmed the scene again and again, with real birds being directed at her by air jets and also being thrown at her by the crew. Rod Taylor was especially troubled by the filming process, later saying, quote, "Hitch put her in a corner in the attic and directed those wonderful men to throw seagulls at her. I wanted to step in." End quote. Hedren's hairstylist, Virginia Darcy, also recalled stepping in and saying to Hitchcock, quote, "If you want an actress tomorrow, you'd better let her go so she can work again. I'm sure you have other shots you can do." End quote. By the 3rd day, Hedren recalled that she was tired. By the 4th day, she was incredibly nervous. And by the 5th day, she had to lie down on the floor, and the birds were tied loosely to her dress by elastic bands. And even then, on that day, one of the birds jumped from her shoulder and onto her face and nearly clawed her eye out. Following this, she remembered throwing all the birds off her, picking herself up from the floor, sitting down and crying. and everybody left me, she later said. The following week, the studio doctor sent her home to rest for the entire 7 days, leaving Hitchcock to complain that without his lead actress, he had nothing left to shoot. Is the 50 seconds of footage in the movie really worth all of that? I'll leave it to you to decide. As regular listeners will know, I'm really not a fan of obvious digital special effects, but I have to say that hearing stories like this, I am actually quite grateful that these days we have CGI. It might not look as realistic, and it might date incredibly badly, but at least nobody nearly loses an eye. Hedren, though, it must be said, gives a very assured performance throughout the film, and it is no wonder that in 1964 she received the Golden Globe Award for New Star of the Year, as well as the Photoplay Award for Most Promising Newcomer. Despite her initial introduction, Melanie is far deeper than she first appears, and it is clear that she has been downed by a tabloid reputation that she is finding difficult to wash away. During a scene in the sand dunes, which I have to admit is so clearly a soundstage that it throws me out of the film every time, Melanie confesses to Mitch that she has felt lost ever since a misreported incident in Rome, and has been trying to find herself and do something more meaningful ever since. She also tells him of her relationship with her mother, who she says ditched her when she was 11, going on to ask Mitch, "Do you know what a mother's love is? Is it better to be ditched?" And Mitch certainly knows what a mother's love is, and as we find out, so does schoolteacher Annie, who's been on the wrong side of it long before Melanie arrives. But while Lydia Brenner, played very well by Jessica Tandy, immediately raises red flags with her cold demeanour and description of Melanie as a girl like that, our perspective is shifted somewhat by an observation from Annie herself. Annie is beautifully played by Suzanne Pleshette and is introduced wearing gardening gear with a smudge of dirt on her face. She is, of course, a deliberate contrast to Melanie's chic and poised demeanour, but, having been in Bodega Bay for a lot longer, also has a keen insight into the psychology of the Brenner household. On the evening of Melanie's arrival, Annie explains that Lydia's attitude towards her nearly drove her crazy, trying to work out what she had done to displease her. She then says that she realised it was her very existence in Mitch's life that was the cause of the issue. But this, according to Annie, is down to a fear of abandonment, rather than the jealous Oedipal situation we might have first suspected. This notion is reinforced by Lydia's dialogue with Melanie after the discovery of Dan Fawcett's body. "I wish I were a stronger person," she says. "It's terrible how you depend on somebody else for strength, and then all of a sudden that person is gone." In this moment, it becomes clear that it was her husband, and not she, who was closer to her children, and now she fears being left with nothing. And this does almost come to pass, as that evening, when Kathy is sick, it is Melanie that she first calls for, though admittedly she does run to her mother when she hears the sound of birds attacking the boarded windows of the house. The discovery of Dan Fawcett's body is a remarkable moment, and is one of the many set pieces that dominate the second half of the film. It is presented completely in silence, without the musical stings that normally accompany such a discovery. The jump cuts were designed to emulate fast intakes of breath, though Hitchcock also admitted filming in this way to allow for an easier edit if they encountered problems with the censor. The depiction of Fawcett with his eyes pecked out was inspired by a story that Hitchcock had been told by a local farmer while on location, who recounted that birds had pecked out the eyes of some of his sheep. And though they had by this time long abandoned du Maurier's original story, this moment is remarkably close to a dreadful discovery made by Nat in the original text, when he visits the farm owned by Mr. and Mrs. Trigg. Quote, "Jim's body lay in the yard. What was left of it? When the birds had finished, the cows had trampled him. His gun was beside him. The door of the house was shut and bolted, but as the windows were smashed, it was easy to lift them. Trigg's body was close to the telephone. He must have been trying to get through to the exchange when the birds came for him. The receiver was hanging loose, the instrument torn from the wall. No sign of Mrs. Trigg. She would be upstairs. Was it any use going up? Sickened, Nat knew what he would find. Thank God, he said to himself, there were no children. He forced himself to climb the stairs, but halfway he turned and descended again. He could see her legs protruding from the open bedroom door. Beside her were bodies of the black-backed gulls and an umbrella, broken. End quote. Other set pieces in the film include the brilliant moment of a multitude of crows silently lining up on the jungle gym as Melanie waits outside the school, another example of the bomb suspense metaphor in action. This is soon followed by a scene in the diner where Melanie tries to convince everyone of the danger while being pooh-poohed by the local ornithologist, Mrs. Bundy. I hardly think, she says patronisingly, that either species would have the intelligence to launch a joint attack, before adding that she finds it incredibly strange that the birds would wait all this time before suddenly starting a war on humanity. At this point, her diatribe is interrupted by the waitress calling out an order of southern fried chicken, which is a nice moment of light ironic comedy, alleviating the tension, but which also rather proves that the birds might have a point. It's the end of the world, I tell you, says a drunk in the corner, before quoting from the Bible, the book of Ezekiel, to be precise. Soon after this, we have the attack of the gulls on the town and the diner, drawn in by the explosion, which we heard about earlier. This begins with a startling and quite literal bird's eye view from high above the town, an impressive combination of superimposition and matte painting. The matte painting was created by British artist Albert Whitlock, who we discussed back in episode 19. Part of his job was to make the filming location of Bodega Bay more visually interesting, even if the town is described by Annie as a couple of shacks on a hillside. After the attack, Melanie and Mitch re-enter the diner, where she, as the newcomer in town, is blamed for the inexplicable attacks. They said when you got here the whole thing started, says a woman who we earlier saw becoming distressed. Who are you? What are you? Where did you come from? I think you're the cause of all this. I think you're evil. Evil. It's no surprise then that Melanie gives the woman a sharp slap around the face, which, to be fair, probably does little to convince her to change her perspective. When I was younger, I thought that this scene was rather hysterical and over the top, and that the woman's reaction didn't really make much sense. But now that I'm definitely older, possibly wiser, and certainly more cynical, I realise that this is in fact a pretty accurate depiction of human psychology. When the unexpected happens, who else do people blame but the outsider and the newcomer? For the attacks, the crew used a combination of mechanical puppets, green screen superimposition, and, as we've heard already, real birds. Prior to filming, Hitchcock hired a bird trainer called Ray Berwick, and the crew went about the process of capturing ravens, crows, seagulls, and sparrows. 3,000 birds were trained using a combination of positive reinforcement, but the film in total used 25,000 birds. And interestingly, at least one of the bird attacks in the movie was based on a real incident, and this is the attack of the sparrows on the Brenner house as they enter through the chimney. In April 1960, in the town of La Jolla, California, there was an unusually large migration of swifts. One cold and windy evening, the home of a couple named Mr. and Mrs. Mosher was invaded by hundreds of the birds, who for some reason found their way down the chimney and into the house. Birds flew wildly about the living room, crashing into furniture, breaking ornaments, and getting caught in Mrs. Mosher's hair. This was apparently so intense that at 8 p.m. local police were called to assist, and, understandably, the Mosher's living room was ruined in the process. It was this event that inspired the attack on the Brenner house after Kathy's birthday party, which includes a shot of a bird, in reality a mechanical prop, caught in actress Jessica Tandy's hair. The scene of Lydia picking up broken china from the floor, watched by an empathetic Melanie, was also inspired by this event, and it nicely foreshadows the broken plates and cups on the dresser that Lydia sees when she first enters the Fawcett house the next day. And then, in 1961, another incident occurred that fed into the narrative of Hunter's screenplay, and this was an event that was reported in the papers under the headline, "Seabird Invasion Hits Coastal Homes." During this incident, thousands of migrating seabirds flew in from Monterey Bay overnight and smashed into a fog-bound coastal area near Santa Cruz, California. Crashing into cars and buildings, they broke telephone aerials and street lamps as well as windows, and also tried to enter houses when the local residents ran out to investigate the noise. That this story inspired Hunter and Hitchcock we know for certain. The director reacted so quickly to the event that his name actually appeared in the initial report in the local newspaper, the Sentinel. The last line of the report says, quote, "A phone call came to the Sentinel from mystery producer Alfred Hitchcock from Hollywood, requesting that the Sentinel be sent to him." End quote. So, if nothing else, we can at least say that Hitchcock's movie is indeed a case of art imitating life. Much like in the original story, in the film no definite explanation is given for the bird's sudden attack. And this is something that caused some criticism when the movie was released, with many suggesting that without an explanation, the film didn't make much sense. But I would argue, how could there possibly be an explanation for an event like this, other than pure speculation and supposition? How do you explain a world that has seemingly turned on its head? During the film's pre-publicity, Hitchcock took a slightly comedic approach to the explanation, with lines that echo the scene in the diner. "If you have ever eaten a turkey drumstick," he said, "or caged a canary, or gone duck hunting, the birds will give you something to think about." But in a recorded interview, he expanded on this further. Quote, "In The Birds, what you have is a kind of overall sketchy theme of everyone taking nature for granted. Everyone took the birds for granted until the birds one day turned on them. The birds had been shot at, eaten, put into cages. They suffered everything from the humans, and it was time they turned on them. Don't mess about or tamper with nature. Who knows? It's feasible in the year 3000 or 4000 for all of the animals to have taken over." End quote. Near the end of the original story, we are given a glimpse into Nat's thought processes, which takes this idea even further. Quote, "Nat listened to the tearing sound of splintering wood, and wondered how many million years of memory was stored in those little brains, behind the stabbing beaks, the piercing eyes, now giving them this instinct to destroy mankind with all the deft precision of machines." End quote. And this idea is something that might spring to mind when you consider the reports of orca whales attacking sailing boats and yachts around the Straits of Gibraltar, attacks which so far have totaled over 700 incidents. If the whales restricted to the ocean have gotten pissed off with the damage caused by humans, then perhaps Hitchcock's vision of the year 3000 might well come sooner than we think. Given Mrs. Bundy's assertion that there were, in 1963, 100 billion birds across the world, it's quite an ominous thought. Joining Tippi Hedren as the male lead is Rod Taylor, who also had a rather difficult time on set, but for very different reasons. A relative newcomer, the Australian actor had arrived in Hollywood from Sydney in 1955, and had begun his US career with TV movies and bit parts, including The Virgin Queen in 1955 with Bette Davis, and also as Elizabeth Taylor's soon-to-be jilted fiancé in Giant, also starring James Dean and Rock Hudson. In 1960, he had a major breakthrough playing the lead in The Time Machine, an adaptation of the H.G. Wells science fiction novel, and it was likely this performance that led to his being recommended to Hitchcock by the powerhouse agent Lew Wasserman. Although he was initially excited to be working with Hitchcock, Taylor did not have an easy time of it on The Birds. He felt that his character, who was reportedly very loosely based on John F. Kennedy, was far too cold and uptight, and tried in vain to inject some warmth into the role. He later said, quote, "Any warmth or masculinity to the character came from me and not Hitch, because he didn't have any experience of behaving like a masculine and rugged man, whether by jumping off the dock or rushing to a woman in need of aid. He had no streak of tenderness for relationships between men and women, and he just didn't show tenderness in his movies. He did give me a few line readings, though, which I ignored." End quote. But Suzanne Pleshette had a very different experience from her two co-stars, perhaps because she instinctively knew how to get on the director's good side, or, at the very least, how to handle him. "I'm pretty bawdy," she said. "He loves those things that are a little bit dirty, and I made him laugh." She also went on to say, quote, "We had a divine relationship, and he wanted to sign me to a multi-picture deal. I said to him, 'This is not going to work, because I know you and the blondes.'" End quote. Making up the third member of the Brenner family is Veronica Cartwright, who had made her big screen debut with the drama The Children's Hour in 1961, but had also appeared in numerous TV shows, including Alfred Hitchcock Presents. 13 years old at the time of filming, she would grow into an actress who has appeared in more than her fair share of horror classics. These include the Philip Kaufman remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1978, Alien in 1979, The Witches of Eastwick in 1987, Candyman 2 Farewell to the Flesh in 1995, and the 2014 remake of The Town That Dreaded Sundown. She gives a very assured performance in the movie and has recounted having a great relationship with the director, saying that, quote, "He just made me feel comfortable and I could ask him any questions I wanted to about the production, the fake birds, everything." End quote. Although her performance is very good, it has to be said that at points Kathy is rather annoying. I wouldn't go as far as writer Camille Paglia, who has said that she would like to slap her, but I have to say that Kathy's insistence on the lovebirds joining them in the car in the film's final moments would probably have gotten a rather sharp response from me, to say the very least. The ending of the film, which is highly ambiguous, is another aspect that drew criticism, though it is certainly an improvement on one that was originally planned. This followed the family driving to San Francisco, suffering another attack on the car, and also featured Melanie nearly throwing herself from the vehicle, crying for her mother. Hedren has recalled listening to the plans for this thankfully aborted climax and thinking to herself, "My God, this just goes on and on. Does it ever end?" Thankfully, the version with which we are now familiar was chosen instead, and this suggests some small form of optimism. As Mitch collects the car, we discover that the attacks have been confined to Bodega Bay and a few surrounding towns, and also that the military have been called in. Though, on reflection, this news does make the opening shot of gulls around San Francisco seem rather redundant. Melanie, almost comatose in shock, is cradled by Mrs. Brenner, finding at once a lost mother figure and a new family. And even though the car must glide silently and engineless down the road to freedom, the sunrise in the distance does seem to promise a small form of hope. This, though, is in direct contrast to the du Maurier story, in which she seems to suggest that the world of man is at an end and that the military will be of no use at all. Quote, "It's always the same," Nat muttered. "They always let us down. Muddle from the start. No plan, no real organisation. And we don't matter down here. That's what it is. The people up country have priority. They're using gas up there, no doubt. And all the aircraft. We've got to wait and take what comes." End quote. Downbeat? Absolutely. More grounded in reality? I would say that's just as certain. On its release in 1963, The Birds received mixed reviews, which might have been inevitable coming on the heels of Psycho. The New York Times and the Washington Post were positive, calling it respectively, quote, "a horror film that should raise the hackles on the most courageous," end quote, and, quote, "gorgeous good fun. I haven't had this kind of merriment since King Kong toppled from the Empire State Building." End quote. Meanwhile, director Andrei Tarkovsky called it a masterpiece and named it one of the 77 essential works of cinema, and the publication Cahiers du Cinéma ranked it second in their top 10 films of the year. Others, however, were not so generous. The New Republic called it Hitchcock's worst thriller, and The New Yorker said that the film was a sorry failure that didn't rouse suspense. The LA Times went even further, suggesting that after both Psycho and The Birds, Hitchcock clearly hated the entire human race and had become a master of the perverse, going all out for shock just for the sake of it. Since then, of course, opinion has swung more in Hitchcock's favour. Federico Fellini said that the film was among his top 10 favourites of all time, and director Akira Kurosawa placed the movie in his top 100. Film critic David Thompson has called it Hitchcock's last unflawed film, and it was also honoured by the American Film Institute as the 7th greatest thriller in American cinema. In 2016, it was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the US Library of Congress, and was selected for preservation in its National Film Registry. Following the release of the movie, Daphne du Maurier's collection The Apple Tree was reprinted under a new tie-in title, The Birds and Other Stories, under which it is still sold today. Tippi Hedren continued her contract with Hitchcock by starring in the psychological thriller Marnie, opposite Sean Connery. As mentioned earlier, it was during the making of this film that she experienced sexual harassment, something she recounted in her biography, Tippi. In this, she recalled that while riding with the director in a limo, he made a pass at her just before the door opened in front of a crowded hotel. She approached Alma, Hitchcock's wife, and asked for help, recounting, quote, "Her exact words were, 'Tippi, I'm so sorry you have to go through all of this.' I looked at her and said, 'But Alma, you could stop it.' And her eyes sort of glazed over, and she walked away." End quote. Following his behaviour towards her, she told him that she wanted to break her contract, at which point he threatened to destroy her career. He might not have used the exact words, "I made you, and I can break you just as easily," but the intent was certainly the same. He kept her under contract and paid her to do nothing for nearly 2 years. This means that she missed out on several film roles which Hitchcock turned down on her behalf and behind her back. This included one for director Francois Truffaut. In 1966, he sold her contract to Universal Studios, and while she continued to act in various movies and TV shows, it's fair to say that she never achieved the levels of stardom that she truly deserved. Her granddaughter, Dakota Johnson, has also gone on record as saying that around this time, or perhaps even before, Hitchcock sent her mother, Melanie Griffith, who, may I remind you, was still a small child, a Christmas present. When she opened it, she discovered a small coffin containing a doll dressed in her mother's costume from The Birds. "What happened with my grandmother was horrific because Hitchcock was a tyrant," Johnson said. "He was talented and prolific and important in terms of art, but power can poison people." In the interest of balance, there have been those who have disputed Hedren's version of events, and while I have made the decision to not go into these here, you can certainly find them online, should you so desire. As for Hedren herself, in an interview with Vanity Fair in 2017, she was asked to give advice to young actresses working today. Her response was, "Don't let a situation get to the point where you can't control it. Ever." Daphne du Maurier's husband, Frederick Browning, died in 1965. She continued to publish both novels and story collections, including the thriller The Flight of the Falcon in 1965 and the science fiction time-travelling novel The House on the Strand in 1969. In the same year, she was appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, or DBE. At around the same time, she decided to write a collection of short stories based on recent holidays. This would be published in 1971 under the title Not After Midnight and Other Stories, and reflected the darker tone that she had demonstrated in The Birds. Within its pages are the title story, which follows a schoolteacher on holiday in Greece and who meets some rather troubling residents at his resort, a borderline case about a young girl delving into her family's past, The Way of the Cross, about a sightseeing cruise to the Middle East, and a very macabre science fiction tale about hypnosis, which seems to fuse Edgar Allan Poe with a plot about capturing the human soul. It also included a story about a grief-stricken couple on holiday in Venice, the title of which was Don't Look Now. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is of course based on this very story. Don't Look Now was released in 1973 and stars Donald Sutherland, Julie Christie and Hilary Mason, and it was directed by Nicolas Roeg. And now we are getting into spoilers for both the story and the film, so my usual warnings apply. Much like The Birds, I would also highly recommend reading the story whether you have or haven't seen the film. The big screen version is faithful to the original text in many respects, and certainly far more so than our first movie this week, but there are some notable differences, and we'll be exploring these as we progress through the rest of the episode. In the meantime, though, I am going to summarise the core aspects of both narratives here. Don't Look Now tells the story of John and Laura Baxter, a British couple staying in Venice, which, despite its picturesque setting, is being troubled by a series of murders. They have recently lost a young daughter named Christine, and also have a son called Johnny, who is back in Britain at boarding school. One day they meet two other British visitors, a pair of elderly sisters, one of whom is blind and who claims to be psychic. She tells Laura that she sees Christine's spirit with them and that she is happy and safe. Laura finds this message to be of great comfort, but John is incredibly cynical and thinks that these sisters must be part of some form of scam. Later, these sisters reveal some new information. The first is that John might have psychic gifts himself, and the second is that the couple are in great danger and should leave Venice immediately. Shortly after this, they receive news that Johnny has been taken ill in England, and Laura travels back on the first available flight to be with him. But after she has supposedly left, John is convinced that he sees her in the city with the two sisters, and is also troubled by repeated glimpses of somebody who he believes to be a small child. Needless to say, it all ends in an incredibly dark and macabre fashion. The idea for the story came to du Maurier from a confluence of seemingly random events. Firstly, of course, she had holidayed in Venice, a city that is, in my opinion at least, one of the most filmic places on earth. I once stayed there myself many years ago, and it quite literally felt like I was on a movie set the entire time, so it's no wonder it's been the location for so many films. There is, of course, this one, but there is also, among others, the psychological thriller The Comfort of Strangers from 1990, starring Rupert Everett, Natasha Richardson, Helen Mirren and Christopher Walken, and the excellent Jali, Who Saw Her Die, directed by Aldo Lado, released in 1972, and The Bloodstained Shadow, directed by Antonio Biddo, released in 1978. Following this, there was The Talented Mr. Ripley, starring Matt Damon and Jude Law in 1999, and more recently, there was the supposed Agatha Christie adaptation, A Haunting in Venice. But as this was filmed mainly on green screen, I don't think it really counts. I would very much like to go back there one day, though I believe it has been plagued by over-tourism in recent years, which has damaged the environment both with wheeled suitcases and rather obnoxious behaviour, not least the horrific wedding of Jeff Bezos and Lawrence Sanchez in 2025. I guess this just goes to prove the old expression, this is why we can't have nice things. While on her own trip to Venice, du Maurier encountered two elderly twin sisters and also mistook a person with dwarfism for a small child, something that becomes horribly important by the end of the story. From these, she crafted a tale that is full of menace while being beautifully written, capturing the evasive quality of the city with her deceptively straightforward prose. Quote, "The water glittered in the sunshine. Buildings shone. Tourists in dark glasses paraded up and down the rapidly receding Molo. Already the terrace of their hotel was out of sight as the ferry turned its way up the Grand Canal. So many impressions to seize and hold, familiar loved facades, balconies, windows, waters lapping at the cellar steps of the little red house where D'Annunzio lived, with its garden. Our house, Laura had called it, pretending it was theirs. And too soon the ferry would be turning left on the direct route to the Piazzale Roma, so missing the best of the canal, the Rialto, and the further palaces." End quote. It is, if nothing else, a very filmic story. In his analysis of the film for the British Film Institute, writer Mark Sanderson has described much of du Maurier's writing as being incredibly cinematic, particularly the insistence on sight and sound which permeates her work. He also highlights that her descriptions of sparkling water, the city after the rain, and the echo of footsteps are expertly captured in Roeg's film. Shortly after its publication in 1971, the film rights were acquired, for an undisclosed sum, by a producer called Peter Katz, who identified the story's potential. He then hired screenwriters Alan Scott and Chris Bryant to adapt the text for the screen. Scott had, by this point, one screenplay under his belt, which was a 1970 British comedy called The Man Who Had Power Over Women, and this, coincidentally enough, had starred Rod Taylor. He would go on to write many successful screenplays, including 3 more for Nicolas Roeg: Castaway in 1986, The Witches in 1990, and Cold Heaven in 1991. Co-writer Chris Bryant had collaborated with Scott already on The Man Who Had Power Over Women, and between the two of them, they took up the challenge of expanding du Maurier's 60-page or so story for the big screen. Once an early draft was written, Katz sent it to Nicolas Roeg, who by this stage had co-directed the film Performance in 1970 with Donald Cammell, and also his first solo directing feature, Walkabout, in 1971. But what is important to note is that by this stage, he had already worked for 25 years in the British film industry. He started out in 1947 as a tea-boy, then moved up to clapperloader, before eventually rising through various apprenticeships to becoming a camera operator, beginning with the 1958 thriller Moment of Indiscretion. He continued as a camera operator through the late 1950s and early 1960s, including the films The Trial of Oscar Wilde in 1960 and the 1961 horror movie Dr. Blood's Coffin. He moved on from this in 1962, when he was made second unit photographer on the David Lean epic Lawrence of Arabia. In the same year, he acted as director of photography on a low-budget British film called Band of Thieves, and then moved into cinematography, including The Caretaker in 1963 and the stunningly photographed Roger Corman movie The Mask of the Red Death, a film that we'll be talking about next week. In 1966, he was cinematographer for Francois Truffaut's movie Fahrenheit 451, which starred Julie Christie, who also starred in 2 more films on which Roeg would work as a cinematographer: Far From the Madding Crowd in 1967 and Petulia in 1968. And I think it's fair to say it is most likely these experiences of working with Christie that led him to believe that only she could play the part of Laura in Don't Look Now, though a bit more on this in a moment. In 1968, he paired with Donald Cammell to make Performance, a film that was initially conceived as a light-hearted romp of the swinging 60s, but which quickly turned into anything but that. Starring James Fox, Mick Jagger and Anita Pallenberg, this is a very dark experimental film about a London gangster hiding from his mobster boss in a house owned by a reclusive retired rock star. With graphic depictions of sex, violence and drug-taking, it truly appalled studio Warner Brothers, who believed they were getting a Rolling Stones version of a Beatles movie. One executive, watching the dailies of Jagger in a bath with Pallenberg and another actress, is alleged to have complained that even the bath water was dirty, and it was shelved until its eventual release, after much re-editing, in 1970. In 1971, he directed the movie Walkabout, which is now considered, along with Wake in Fright, to be one of the first films in the Australian New Wave cinema movement. Along with Wake in Fright, which was released the same year, it was entered into competition at the Cannes Film Festival. This was loosely based on a novel of the same name by the writer James Vance Marshall. It tells the story of two children who were stranded in the outback following the death of their father, and who are saved by an Aboriginal boy who helps them to survive. It's gone on to be celebrated quite widely, with the hallucinogenic quality of its cinematography widely applauded, and it's also been listed by the British Film Institute as one of the 50 films you should see before the age of 14. At the time that he received the script for Don't Look Now, Roeg has said that he was looking for, quote, a script that was a yarn, that would complete in some way, continue in some way, a line of thought, end quote. He went on to explain what he meant by this, saying, quote, you remember that scene at the beginning of the film where Julie Christie mentions the little girl's question, if the world is round, why is frozen water flat? And Donald Sutherland says, nothing is what it seems. This is the key to the whole premise of the film, and is exactly the feeling that I have about life anyway. End quote. Impressed by the screenplay, he then read du Maurier's story, later saying that although he never met her, he was a great admirer, calling her an extraordinary writer, and saying that it's no fluke that so many interesting movies are made from her novels. Although du Maurier was not involved in the making of the film whatsoever, she was reportedly far more pleased with the final product than she was with the birds, and she also asked for photographs of Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie during pre-production to see what they looked like. Following the film's release, she wrote a letter to Roeg complimenting him on capturing the emotions of the characters in the story, even if, as the director has said, the film versions are very different people. This is partly due to the expansion of the rather short story into a 2-hour movie, but also due to the director's perception of the characters. According to Mark Sanderson, the real-life couple of Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner were very briefly mentioned in connection with the film, but Roeg had always envisioned Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland in the roles. He particularly liked the idea of an English woman and an American man, rather than two English, or indeed two American people, saying that this created an idea of fitting but misfitting, and two characters coming from two different backgrounds who lived on common ground. As we've heard, Roeg had worked with Julie Christie before, though for her part she says she has no idea why he wanted her for the role. In interviews conducted by Sanderson in 1996, she revealed that she accepted the part because she was impressed by the script, but also because she wanted to work with Roeg as a director, saying that he had both an unusual eye and an unusual mind. She also went on to say that the whole film was a bit of a risk and it could have gone completely haywire, though at the same time admitted that she didn't like quote-unquote run-of-the-mill stuff anyway. For Donald Sutherland, the script was fascinating, particularly as he had an interest in ESP, but he initially felt that the downbeat ending portrayed the idea of psychic phenomena in the wrong way. In his view, he felt that ESP was a positive aspect of the human condition, and that with this in mind his character should benefit from it rather than having it destroy him. Roeg, understandably enough, was insistent that they should film what was in the script, and told him that if he wanted to do the film, they would be shooting exactly what was in the screenplay. Sutherland later admitted in an interview for the Studio Canal Blu-ray release that this conversation and Roeg's very matter-of-fact response taught him a valuable lesson, that actors are workers, and while you can offer suggestions, it isn't your place to make the film. And to be honest, the film is rather educational about ESP. Ultimately, John decides to ignore the warning that he is given, and it is this that leads to his untimely end, as opposed to the phenomena in and of itself, though a bit more on that in a moment. Although both actors were keen to make the film, for a while it seemed as if neither would be available. Sutherland was already shooting a movie, and Julie Christie was busy in the US, supporting the presidential campaign of Senator George McGovern against President Richard Nixon. But then, as fate would have it, Sutherland's film fell through and Nixon defeated McGovern, meaning that both actors suddenly became available. The chemistry between the two leads is incredibly strong, and the casual easiness with which they interact on screen for much of the film gives the suggestion of a real married couple rather than two actors pretending. The relationship before the family tragedy is captured very well in their exchange during the film's prologue, and the shift in their dynamic post-tragedy is depicted subtly but to great effect through their coolness to each other when we first meet them in Venice. Sitting at the table in the restaurant, their interactions are noticeably more stilted than the pair we meet in the film's opening moments, shown through the almost throwaway moment of John's hand cautiously reaching out to hers. Much has been made of the lengthy love scene between the two actors, with more than a few suggestions made in the past that the two had sex for real, which both suggests an ignorance of how most films are made and also completely misses the point. Roeg has said that this moment is a conjugal scene as opposed to just sex, and that it depicts a couple trying to retrieve a lost connection, something that he has described as an intangibility that is impossible to recapture. The scene was shot surreptitiously in a hotel room with just the two actors, Roeg and cinematographer Anthony B. Richmond. It was also choreographed incredibly carefully and shot seconds at a time before the actors were asked to change position. Nevertheless, despite the very reduced crew and protected environment, Sutherland has described approaching the filming of the sequence a bit like going into a death chamber. And incidentally, this scene, which caused some consternation with censors and earned the film an R rating in the US and an X certificate in the UK, was emulated deliberately by Steven Soderbergh for his 1998 thriller Out of Sight. The most significant change that the film makes to the story is in the nature of young Christine's death. In the text, her death is caused by meningitis, and it happens before the story has begun. We are introduced to the couple with no prior knowledge of their family history, and it is something that du Maurier reveals as the story progresses. In the film, of course, it is not the horror of meningitis which takes their daughter, but instead a truly horrific accident. This is depicted in the opening moments of the film, in a scene which, quite honestly, I still find very difficult to watch, particularly Donald Sutherland's gut-wrenching wail as he pulls Christine out of the water. The shift from disease to drowning is an important one, as it adds a level of guilt to the characters. Not only have they lost a child, but they have somehow failed as parents, exposing Christine to dangers which, as Laura reminds him early in the film, were very much John's fault. This opening not only sets up the family tragedy, but also the idea of precognition that dominates the rest of the film. We open with a grey English winter day, a downpour of rain and water splashing into a pond as the camera zooms in. There is no music here, only the sound of the downpour, as the lead actors' names and the director's credit appear on the screen. Then, all of a sudden, we are disorientated by a different image. Glimpses of sun shining through something, a curtain, a window, possibly stained glass. We do not know it yet, but we are seeing light through the window of their hotel in Venice, and therefore, much like John, we have been given a very small glimpse of the future. From here, we are suddenly back in England. The rain is over, and the children, Christine and Johnny, play outside, while a pastoral version of composer Pino Donaggio's elegy for Laura plays gently in the background. Inside the house, John and Laura talk, while John examines photographic slides, one of which features a girl in a red coat inside the church. Given that we have seen Christine in her red raincoat outside, it is quite clearly a picture of her. But this is precognition yet again, as this image, which becomes far more menacing after a spillage of water, also anticipates John's killer and his eventual demise. The editing in this opening is simply exquisite, as it is through much of the movie, and again hints at the themes of premonition. This is most obvious when John realises something has happened to his daughter, but also in much smaller moments that are far too many to mention. The technique of using the edits to highlight ESP is repeated throughout the film, creating a sense of otherworldliness and the idea that everything is connected. Everything that we are seeing forms a pattern, all of which leads to a climax that, despite the best intentions of the blind sister Heather, is ultimately completely inevitable. John's psychic abilities are somewhat played down in du Maurier's original story. In fact, at the beginning, they amount to little more than a few throwaway lines, though these are expanded on towards the end of the text. In the film, these flashes are made far more apparent, from the opening sense that Christine is in trouble to a repeated feeling of déjà vu that hangs over him when he is in Italy. The psychic phenomena is made far more apparent in the film, with greater discussion as to its nature. Heather calls this a curse as well as a gift, before complaining that people, quote, want a lot of mumbo-jumbo about ectoplasm and holding hands, end quote. And of course there is also a séance scene with Heather attempting to contact Christine's spirit, which doesn't appear in the original story. One thing the two do share, though, is a later vision, as she has a clear premonition of John's death. These moments in the film are both animalistic and almost epileptic, suggesting that the visions are perhaps not, as she has earlier suggested, a gift from a lord who sees all things. Daphne du Maurier herself, it would appear, was interested in the paranormal as more than just a plot device. In a 1987 reprint of some of her classics of the macabre, she opens with a note to the reader, saying, quote, "Though not at all psychic, I have never seen a ghost or dabbled in spiritualism or the occult. I have always been fascinated by the unexplained and the darker side of life. I have a strong sense of the things that lie beyond our day-to-day perception and experience. It is perhaps an extension of this feeling that makes me live through the characters that I create." End quote. And it would appear that in the movie at least, John and Heather are not the only people who are gifted with psychic abilities. The bishop, a character not in the original text, appears to be gifted too. When in the film he tells John that he wishes he didn't believe in prophecy, we take this to be a comment on religion. But at the end of the film, we sense that he is receiving visions of John's murder as well, waking in the night with a glowing red candle on the mantle, which of course echoes the killer's red coat. Everything in the film then seems like an omen or a portent of danger. As well as the moments already mentioned, there is the breaking of glass as Johnny rides his bike over it, which is brilliantly echoed in the smashing of the mosaic tiles in the renovated church. There is also a brief moment of wind extinguishing a candle just lit by Laura in a different church as she travels back from the hospital. There is also the disquieting discovery of a glove left abandoned on a window ledge and a child's doll by the edge of the water. All of these moments add both menace and a sense that, again, everything is interconnected. In this case, then, time is neither linear nor a flat circle, but seems more like a series of ribbons that weave in and around each other before becoming unravelled in the film's climax. Psychic phenomena was very much a staple of horror cinema in the 1970s. Films including Carrie, The Medusa Touch, The Shout, The Fury, and Eyes of Laura Mars all featured characters who were gifted or cursed with second sight, telekinesis, and all sorts of other supernatural abilities. This is a trend that we haven't seen so much of in recent years, with people now believing more in glitches in the Matrix than they do in the power of the human mind. I'm not sure what this says about us as a society, but I have to admit I miss the cinematic trend. We've had quite a few films about magic, and also, in my opinion, one too many reworkings of Carrie, But those aside, I cannot really think of many movies that have dealt with these abilities in a dramatic fashion. One possible exception, though, I guess, is Mike Flanagan's adaptation of Dr. Sleep, so maybe we will see it make a comeback once again. I guess this, though, will depend on how well his upcoming reimagining of Carrie, yet again, is received. The two sisters are also given much more space in the movie, with their roles expanded and turned into something perhaps a little more sinister. In the text, they are identical twins, and seem initially at least rather like joke characters, described by John and Laura as male criminals in drag. In the film, they appear far more frequently, and are set up as much more disturbing characters. Scenes that in hindsight are perfectly innocent, such as laughing over family photographs or checking into a new hotel room, are suddenly loaded with menace, all of which reflects John's growing paranoia. The sisters are played incredibly well by the English character actress Hilary Mason and Italian actress Clelia Matania, and their presence as they appear and disappear across the course of the narrative is incredibly disquieting. Mason, in particular, is extremely good, running her fingers along the bars of a shrine in the church, and also, of course, in the two possession sequences. There's also the beautifully scripted and acted scene where John walks her home from the police station, when she tells him she feels safer in Venice as the sound changes when you go near a canal. Don't Look Now is probably the film for which she is most famous. For much of her career, she appeared as a fixture on various British TV comedy shows, though she did also appear in at least 2 other horror movies to my knowledge. These are the rather dreadful I Don't Want to Be Born from 1975, which starred Joan Collins, and also Stuart Gordon's rather endearing low-budget shocker Dolls from 1987, a film for which, I have to confess, I have a certain amount of fondness. Another change to the story is the rationale for John and Laura's trip to Venice, and this change makes absolute perfect sense given the nature of Christine's demise in the film. After all, Venice would hardly be an ideal holiday destination for a couple who were mourning the loss of their drowned child. In the film, John is restoring a church, which allows for several scenes concerning the nature of God and religion. The bishop, who, again, comes across as a rather sinister figure through much of the film, suggests that God no longer cares about churches, and suggests that since people have stopped listening, God must have other priorities. John himself comments unfavourably on the church in which Laura lights her candles, and even suggests that the one he is restoring is little more than a fake facade. And John's occupation also gives rise to another uncomfortable moment, which is his near death inside the chapel as he stands on a builder's gantry. This sequence was completed by Sutherland himself, when his stuntman refused to do it because the pay wasn't good enough. How Sutherland, who suffers from vertigo, managed this moment is quite beyond me, though he has said it was not until many years later, when speaking to a different stuntman, that he realised exactly how close to his own death he actually came. The reason for the trip to Venice also allowed Roeg to change the setting of the film from summer to winter, depicting a city that is far removed from the extract that you heard earlier. There are no tourists here. The hotel, which is described in the text as being warm and comfortable, is replaced by one that is deserted and closing for the winter. The furniture in the lobby is covered with sheeting, and it is clear by the attitudes of the staff that John and Laura are the only occupants. This is a city that is oddly deserted, something that feeds into the film's oppressive atmosphere and sense of impending doom. The only people we see stare out of windows, only to retreat back into darkness, and the crowds that we encounter are not du Maurier's sunglasses-wearing travellers, but are people drawn by the murders, staring from bridges as the police pull yet another body. There are also barely a handful of shots of famous Venetian landmarks, a glimpse of St. Mark's Place here, a shot of a palace there. This sense of oppression, doom and abandonment feeds into the film's overall atmosphere, and it's no wonder that one of the sisters describes Venice as, quote, a city in aspic, left over after a dinner party, and all of the guests are dead or gone. Aside from the main sequences, many of the shots we see of the waterways were filmed on impulse, with Tony Richmond grabbing shots of an unseen Venice as the team travelled to and from their official locations. And although the line about aspic was an invention of the filmmakers rather than du Maurier, she too showed the strange duality of the city in her writing, with the John of the story observing, quote, the experts are right. Venice is sinking. The whole city is slowly dying. One day the tourists will travel here by boat to peer down into the waters, and they will see pillars and columns and marble far, far beneath them. Slime and mud uncovering, for brief moments, a lost underworld of stone. End quote. The climax of the movie, mirroring John's fate in the story, is shocking and bleak, made all the more so by the sudden realization on the part of the viewer that all paths have led to this from the start of the picture. In this moment, we suddenly understand that all clues have been there in front of us had we only been able to read them. It's a fantastically dark ending that unites the brilliance of the original author with the visual brilliance of the director, and is of course now, deservedly, very famous. On its release in 1973, Don't Look Now was generally very well received by the critics, particularly the performances and Nicolas Roeg's direction. However, perhaps not surprisingly, it wasn't well received by the Venetian Tourist Board, who were worried that it would scare away visitors. I think it's fair to say, though, that they really didn't have anything to worry about. Its cinematography won Tony Richmond a BAFTA, and it also received nominations for Best Film, Best Direction, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Soundtrack, and Best Film Editing. Over the years, it has been cited as impactful by many, and has featured on far too many top 10 and top 50 horror lists to mention. Its admirers include Martin McDonagh, Christopher Nolan, Steven Soderbergh, Danny Boyle, Lynn Ramsey, and Ari Aster, who has said that the film was a key influence on his 2018 movie Hereditary. Following Don't Look Now, Nicolas Roeg directed The Man Who Fell to Earth, Bad Timing, Insignificance, Track 29, Heart of Darkness, and The Witches, to name just a few. Described as a fearless visionary and an inimitable filmmaker, he died from complications relating to dementia in 2018. He was 90 years old. Daphne du Maurier never used the title of Dame that was bestowed upon her in 1969, and according to her biographer, told very few people about the honour. Even her children only learned of it from reading the newspapers. Following the ceremony, she slipped out quietly to avoid the attention of the press. Her final novel, Rule Britannia, was published in 1972. She died from heart failure in her sleep on the 19th of April 1981 at her home in Cornwall. She was 81 years old. The Birds and Don't Look Now are both films with rather bleak or unresolved endings that refuse to spell things out for the viewer, and both also depict the normal world as places of inexplicable horror, whether that be a restaurant in Venice or a waterfront diner in Bodega Bay. Both are also films about misreading or ignoring warnings. John's conviction that psychic phenomena don't really exist leads to his death, and the townspeople of Bodega Bay ignore Melanie's experiences until it's all far too late. More importantly, of course, what links them is their original creator, Daphne du Maurier, a highly influential writer whose work is still adapted for television and film and the stage today. If you've never read any of her work, I hope that one day you might consider, at the very least, picking up one of her short stories. Of course, I highly recommend The Birds and Don't Look Now, although I have pretty much spoiled them over the course of the last hour or so. Rebecca is also a masterpiece, and a much darker piece of writing than popular belief would have you expect. And I would also highly recommend The Apple Tree, which is a more subtle piece of work, but is decidedly creepy. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And also remember, you can email to thehorrordouble@gmail.com and follow the Instagram account @thehorrordouble. Next week, we have a double bill about plague, Satanism, religious intolerance, and witchcraft. First up, as I mentioned earlier, we have The Mask of the Red Death from 1964. This was directed by Roger Corman and stars Vincent Price, Hazel Court, Patrick McGee, and Jane Asher. And then we follow this with A Plague of a Different Colour, with Black Death from 2010, directed by Christopher Smith. This stars Eddie Redmayne, Sean Bean, Andy Nyman, and Carice Van Houten. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are available in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.